What we're going to talk about now in this second part of these lectures on the nervous system is how did the nervous system evolve from a very simple, basically net of neurons all the way to the complex neuron consisting of a central, peripheral nervous system, as we see, for example, in our own body. And then we'll finish up talking about the structure of the human nervous system. So, in terms of evolutionary trend, the nervous system became from a very, very simple net of simple neurons, like is the one, for example, of cnidarians you see here, the hydra, this animal right here, to a more complex system that first started seeing like an aggregation of different type of neurons. That's what we refer to as ganglia that throughout time started becoming cephalized, so going towards the head ultimately of the animals, and forming a more complex certain nervous system consisting of a brain, which is different than a ganglia, a spinal cord, and then a peripheral nervous tissue. So looking at some of these animals, first of all, sorry, what I mean by ganglia is simply a group of nerve cells, so of neurons, which have some interconnections. So they're connected with each other. They really serve, in reality, they don't really serve the whole body, but usually they cover only part of the body. So it's different from what a brain is, and we'll discuss in the next lecture. When we talk about cephalization, what we talk about is how these ganglia, they got together forming brains, and they start localizing themselves into the head ultimately of the animal and start fusing, forming the brain. And finally then we have a nerve core, which is basically a series of neurons forming an extension of the central nervous system so that it can reach from the cephalized region, from the brain, the rest of the body from there on, forming after that the peripheral nervous system. So what is the difference, first of all, between a brain and a ganglion? So when we talk about ganglion, we're talking about basically a series of neurons that are clustered together. But this neuron can form some interconnection, but they have very limited capacity of integration of information, such as detection of different type of signals like light, heat, pressure. So they have very limited capacity to integrate information. When we talk about brain instead, first of all, we talk about a structure that is found on the head, so a cephalic region of an animal. Second thing that differentiates a brain versus a ganglia is that it serves the whole body. So all the information for the whole body will go through the brain instead of separate different cluster of neurons like ganglia. Ganglia would just serve part of the body. And then it's formed by two lobes. Here you have an example of a human brain. So you can see it's separated into a left and a right hemisphere. So two different lobes here connected through the corpus callosum here, where there are distinct regions. We'll talk about later on, for example, how there is a temporal region, a occipital region, and so on in the brain. Regions that have different functions, very specific functions. And then also the structure itself of a brain is always has the body of the neurons on the surface. That's what we define as the gray matter. This is a section of a human body, how it will look. You always have the bodies here on the gray matter, and then you would have the white matter. So the extension, the axon coming out from the body, all clustered toward the inside of the brain. So how did the nervous system evolve over time? So here you see an example of the very, very simple nervous system you see in this type of invertebrates, which are cnidarians. So in this case, there is basically almost no nervous system. All you have is a series of nerves or neurons that form nets. They're interconnected with each other, forming some sort of synapses, chemical synapses. But there are no ganglia. There is no real organization. In fact, there is not even direction in which the signal is carried by these nerves. So if you press in any of these parts, the signal will go in all directions. So extremely basic, still controls a little bit of functions, some contractions and so on, but there is no real structure that control or integrate in any sort of way the information that is provided by these type of nerve nets, as they are called. Then you can see the nerves, they tend, or the neurons tend to cluster more and more into structures similar to what we see in nerves nowadays. So you have several nerves, several axons here, and nerves joined together. And here, in echinoderms, such as this starfish, for example, you can start seeing there is still no ganglia, absolutely no ganglia, but you start having a structure here, a nerve ring, which later on might have evolved into a ganglia. Again, there is a better organization in this case. It's not just almost like a random net. So there are nerves formed, but again, there are no ganglia, no center of any source of integration of this information. Then later on in evolution, still in some invertebrates such as this flatworm, you start seeing now the neurons, they start clustering together, finally forming ganglia. Now, you can call this structure you see here in flatworm is cephalized. It's really hard to call it a brain. It's more like two ganglia joined together. But what you start seeing is that now this structure, whether you call it as ganglia or brain, in this case, considering the organization, there are no really specialized areas, so I would not consider a brain. But these ganglia here, they start finally also receiving and integrating some sensory information. For example, the flatworms have these eye spots. They're not really eyes, but they can still detect light, but they can't really interpret into an image. But the ganglia here now, they receive the information from this eye spot and start doing some sort of first level integration. The other thing you start seeing now at this point throughout evolution is not only the clustering into ganglia, but also the formation of some sort of cord. In this case, it's a double cord, two cords connected with each other, connected to the two ganglia in the cephalic region, and you have now nerves coming out from these cords. And so you can start seeing already a very primordial type of primary central nervous system here, and a peripheral nervous system consisting of the short nerves coming out. Now this system is getting more and more complicated. You can see, for example, in insects, now you have that the ganglia, they start forming an actual brain on the cephalic region, where you can have now a dorsal, a ventral pair, which start becoming some sort of two separate different type of brain regions with different function as well. And they start interpreting also more and more signal. For example, in insects, you now have the information coming from the antennae, coming from the eyes. There's some hair that sends information as well to the brain. And then you start having that now also the cord start extending again throughout the whole body, start forming some sort of ganglia that control specific regions of the body, similar to what we have in terms of segments in our spinal cord nowadays dedicated to specific dermatomes. We'll talk about that later on. So even the spinal cord become more and more specialized. You can see also when you have segments that fuse together, the same thing happened to the ganglia. So following the overall structure of the body. Now the brain gets more and more complex, and you can still see here in invertebrates when we talk about cephalopods. Now they start having a very complex type of brain, which has several different regions. It has a defined sensory and motor region found in their brain, so they can control, one region can control the motion, the other one perceive all the different type of sensation, and start interpreting a lot of signaling. Particularly they start having very effective eyes whose information is integrated inside the brain. The other big thing you see here now in mollusks is also the more pronounced type of cephalization that you have in there. And finally, once you get to vertebrates, you can start seeing a final nervous system much more similar, much more complex and similar to the one that we have nowadays. You have a clear brain now with lots of different regions, dedicated regions to specific functions, obviously cephalized, but at this point was already cephalized in other animals as well. You can see a clear, distinct single spinal cord, which now is divided into different regions, serving each region a specific part of the body through a peripheral nervous system which has also its own ganglia on the side, as we do have right now. So this system you see right here, for example, in this animal, will be very, very similar, you see, to the one we have right now. So, which leads to the last part of this talk, which is on the structure of the human nervous system. Now, these slides can scare you, but it's much simpler than it looks. You'll see at the end, we'll summarize it again with going back to all of this. But basically, when you look at the human nervous system, you can see that its complexity is organized in several different, it can be clustered in several different ways. So you have, first of all, you can identify a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, which are in continuity with each other, which are protected by the skull and the spinal, the vertebrae there. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the nerves coming out from the central nervous system, coming out from the spinal cord here. Now, when it comes to the peripheral nervous system, you can separate an afferent nervous system, which is the one that brings the information in, the sensory information, from all the sensory receptor, such as could be your eyes, it could be your skin, so the pressure, the nerves dedicated to detect pressure in your skin and so on. It brings all of this information into the central nervous system. That's the afferent component of the peripheral nervous system. Together with that, you have also an efferent component, which consists, instead of that part that takes the information, once it has been integrated by the central nervous system, the information takes it away and it brings it to what we call the efferent structures, which could be a skeletal muscle, could be your heart, could be different, or your blood vessels, the smooth muscles in your blood vessels. Now, the efferent component of the peripheral nervous system now can be divided in two parts. There is a somatic system that basically controls all your skeletal muscles, and an autonomic system that instead controls your cardiac muscle and the smooth muscle, that basically involuntary component, fully involuntary component of your system. And this can be divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic system, depending on whether it acts through stress or not. Now, let's look at the structure, first of all, of the central nervous system. So there are two components, the brain and the spinal cord. When it comes to the brain, we're talking about the cephalized region inside the skull, which basically integrates all sorts of information coming from the whole body. Now, the brain itself can grossly be divided into four specialized areas. You have the cerebrum, or cerebral hemisphere here, sorry. The limbic system, which in terms of embryonic growth is referred to as the diencephalon, but it will be the limbic system here in the inside part. We're talking about thalamus, hypothalamus, and so on. Then you have a cerebellum, and then you have a brain stem right here. All of these parts that have specific different function, with the cerebral hemisphere or cerebrum here being the one that has the function mostly of integration. So, looking at the different parts, starting from the cerebellum here. The cerebellum, basically what it does, it integrates sensory signals coming from the eyes, ear, muscles, all body parts. Together with the motor signals, it communicates with the cerebrum. But it takes all of this information, and ultimately the main function that it has is to use the information to coordinate your body movement. This is an essential area for your posture, control of your stability of your body, and so on. Just to give you an example, my grandmother, unfortunately, she had a stroke in the cerebellum, which ultimately led to her death a few years later. But what happened to her, she had a stroke, and a stroke is nothing else than basically a little clog that happens in one of your blood vessels here in your brain, and which basically caused to stop the blood from going past that blockage. Okay, so what it means is that then all the tissues, so all the nervous tissues past the blockage will not receive nutrients anymore, cannot exchange oxygen, carbon dioxide, and will die very quickly. All right. So anything downstream of the blockage of the stroke dies. And so unfortunately, she had it on the cerebellum, and she looked perfectly normal. She could move her legs. She could move. She could talk a little bit, but she seemed perfectly normal after that. And so we tried to rehab her, and what we could see is that we could actually lift her up from the chair. We could hold her. She could move her leg, but as soon as we would let her go, she would fall down. And the reason being exactly that. The region that was affected was within the cerebellum, which again has the major role of coordinating ultimately all the body movements by integrating all of this information from your eyes, ears, and putting them together to basically balance it, all of them. The second region here in the brain is the brainstem. This is that region, essential region that control all the basic function in your body, such as the breathing, the heart rate, when you're sleeping, your sleeping cycle, and so on. Now, there are three major regions that you can see here. There is the midbrain, the pons, and then medulla oblongata, which is the one that ultimately connects the brain to the spinal cord. So they have different functions. The pons is the major traffic information between the cerebellum, so this region here, and the cerebrum here, so the higher integration area here. So it's part ultimately or of this function right here, but it doesn't really coordinate itself, but it transfers all of this information back and forth. Then you have the midbrain here, which is this region right here, which coordinates all the reflexes to both visual and auditory input. For example, if somebody scares you, your automatic reflex that you have to run away is actually going through the midbrain. And then you have the medulla oblongata here, which is controlling basic but essential functions in your body, involuntary tasks, all of these, which are, for example, respiration and the blood circulation. So when you have, for example, your pressures that is going up too high, you would have some afferent neuron that would take the information here, would be integrated, and then there will be a response mediated by efferent neurons, which will cause the vasodilation, for example, of your blood vessel in response to the high pressure, causing the release of the pressure. And the same thing, you could slow down your heart rate and so on. And the same thing for respiration is controlled based on also your need for oxygen, responding to that through the medulla oblongata. Third region, the big boss here, is the cerebrum. So this is the largest part of the brain, has different dimensions depending on the animals. It's very, very large in our case, and controls all the higher functions. So is in charge basically of the integration, the complex integration of several informations and the decision making within your body. And so it controls also all the voluntary movements of your skeletal muscles, such as, for example, it's controlling right now the movement of my tongue while I speak, not only my tongue, but all the rest. I'm moving my hands a lot, for example, while I speak. Now, it's divided into four main regions. So you have a frontal area called the frontal lobe. Then you have a top area here in the middle. It's called the parietal lobe. The back is referred to as the occipital lobe, and then you have on the side the temporal lobes here. So all of these regions have different functions. The frontal lobe basically responsible for cognitive functions and voluntary movement. It's not unusual to have people that have serious concussion on the frontal lobe, and you can see how, for example, they may lose inhibition. They start telling you everything about themselves, even though they were very reserved people. They lose basically their cognitive functions or part of that, and they start telling you everything. They don't have that filter anymore. They don't pass that information through the frontal lobe well enough anymore. They're responsible also for all the voluntary movements. So when you're deciding to pick up a cup, it's actually all that decision is coming from your frontal lobe. Then the parietal lobe here is extremely important to process all the sensations that are coming from different parts of your body. So for example, temperature, your movement, or your touch, the taste. When you taste something sweet, is activating this area here. You can actually see the activation, by the way, using specialized MRIs that follow basically the consumption of glucose It's a very interesting actually thing to see. If you want to look on Facebook, look for that. You can see how different areas can be activated by different type of stimuli, and you will see that it will correspond to these regions. The third region here is the temporal lobe here, which is extremely important to process and associate memories and associate them particularly to different type of sensations such as taste, touch, sound, and so on. And then finally, the last region here is the occipital lobe, which is responsible for the vision. Is actually getting the signal from your eyes through the thalamus first, and then get all that information from your optic nerves, again through the thalamus, not directly, and then it integrates all that information there, basically creating the image that you see ultimately. Third part of the brain here is the limbic system. Sorry, the last part of the brain that we'll talk about here is the limbic system, also referred to as the diencephalon here. This is a word that refers more to the way in which it develops in the embryo. And now it consists of different parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, you have the amygdala, and the hippocampus here, all with different functions there. So what do they do? Well, the thalamus is basically the relay sensor of all the different type of sensation that your body picks up, except for the smell. And what it does, basically perceives, so if you're touching something, if you feel heat, extreme heat, and so on, will go through your thalamus, and then from there it will direct it to the specific region of the cerebrum or the cerebellum as well, when it comes to information necessary for the integration, for the overall balance of the body. For example, here you see what happens to the vision I was already mentioning in the previous slide. So this is how your eye will look from the inside if you take away the skull here, and they're connected to the brain through the optic nerve. Two optic nerves, which through this chiasma here, they ultimately connect to the opposite hemisphere here. And so what these nerves do, they first connect in this region of the thalamus, which is referred to as the lateral geniculate nuclei. You don't need to remember these names, but here they get first through the thalamus here, and then from there that information get relayed to the occipital area here of your brain. What this hypothalamus does instead, the hypothalamus controls homeostasis in general. Particularly, you see when we talk about the endocrine system, it has an essential role controlling so many other glands through the projection of the hypothalamus itself, which is a gland, which is referred to as the hypophysis. So by doing that, controls calcium reabsorption, different mineral reabsorption, controls growth, controls so many things inside your body. Then you have the amygdala. This is the center which controls your emotion. Highly activated, not surprising, very highly activated in parents. For example, with kids, if you do study, you see it's much more activated, particularly in mothers. And what it does, it controls emotion, particularly controls anger. Now, surprisingly, is the target of this group of drugs referred to as benzodiazepines. Drugs of different types that are used, for example, to control anxiety, such as Valium is one of them, for example, or diazepam is another one, or controlling anxiety, stress, controlling, for example, seizures as well. The last area here in the limbic system is the hippocampus, which is the center where actually your memory are formed. They're not stored there, they're stored in the cerebrum, but the long-term memories ultimately are formed from experiences or short-term memories. Something that's just happened gets converted into short-term memories and can be converted into a long-term memory exactly here in the hippocampus. So that is for the brain. So we talk about the four different parts of the brain. Now let's move on to the second part of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. This cord has the function to connect ultimately the brain to the peripheral nervous system, both to get information from the peripheral nervous system and bring them to the brain, and vice versa, to execute the product of the integration by the brain and bringing it to the peripheral nervous system. Now it goes from the medulla oblongata here, from the midbrain, basically to the lumbar region. We'll see in the next slide. And it consists of 31 different segments, different regions, which control different parts of the body. Similar to, remember when we were talking about insects that have the different ganglia there. Now, this region can be divided into 31 segments, or it can be divided into 4 regions. You have a cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral region. Each of these, segment 2, will have 2 nerves coming out, one for each side of the body, the right and left, and each nerve will consist of both the sensory or afferent component and the motor or efferent component mixed together. And now each of these nerves will serve both in terms of sensing and controlling through the motor neurons only a specific part of the body, which is referred to as the dermatome. Again, think similar to what was in insects. You had different segments controlled by different ganglia, similar here. So this is how, again, the spinal cord is organized. You have 31 segments there, labeled as C1, C2, C3, and so on, and the corresponding nerves are referred to the same number, C1, C2, and so on. And so you can distinguish 4 different main regions: the cervical cord here, you have the thoracic cord here, the lumbar cord, and finally the sacral cord here. And now, if you look at their sections, you will see that each section here, so this will correspond to a cervical section, this is a thoracic section here. Each one of them would have 2 nerves coming out, both with the afferent and efferent component here. And these nerves will be serving different dermatomes, which are represented here in different colors in this schematic of this body. For example, the region or the nerves that control this part of your forearm, the external part of your forearm here, controlling both the thumb and the index finger, but not the other fingers here, it will be this region right here, the C6 region, whereas the C7 region will be controlling these other 2 fingers here. So again, these are the nerves. So C6 will be the nerves coming out from this region, the cervical segment here, C6, of your cervical cord, whereas the C7 here will control these other fingers here, and all the others, obviously, they follow. Okay, so let's move now to the peripheral nervous system. As we say before, it's divided into, there are 2 components: the afferent component, which is the one that basically collects the information, sensory informations, from both the outside and the inside of the body. And then you have an efferent component, which is the motor component, which basically brings the information from the nervous system, central nervous system, to the final effector, which will be whatever it is. It could be a muscle, it could be a gland, it could be many different things. And then let's see how this is all organized. So now, as I said before, so there is an afferent component, which is collecting the informations. So it could be coming from your eyes, for example, could be coming from your skin, and so on. And that component is the one that takes all this information ultimately to the central nervous system. And then you have an efferent component of the peripheral nervous system, which instead is carrying the information from the central nervous system to the ultimately effector. In this example here would be a skeletal muscle. Now, the afferent component is singular for the peripheral nervous system. There is no division, subdivision there. When we look at the efferent component here, it can be divided first of all into somatic and automatic peripheral nervous system. The somatic component of the peripheral nervous system is the one that basically controls skeletal muscles. And by doing that, it controls all the voluntary movements that you do. Okay, so your lifting weights is controlled by your somatic system. But it controls also those involuntary movements, such as your shivering, your overall posture. You're not there, oh my gosh, now I'm gonna stay straight. No, your body does it on its own with the help of the cerebellum, just to practice a little bit. And so all of these components, voluntary components, still rely on the work of skeletal muscles, and therefore are still under control of the somatic peripheral nervous system here. Now, a unique feature you see that differently from the autonomic system, We'll talk about in a second about that. Now, when it comes to the neurons here, all of these muscles here are controlled by a single afferent neuron. Afferent neuron that has the body inside the spinal cord in a specific section, depending on what you're talking about here, and then that goes through directly to the effector, in this case a skeletal muscle here. And these are myelinated type of neurons which will conduct the signal in a saltatory way. The autonomic system instead controls basically all the involuntary processes that do involve the cardiac muscle. You don't control your heartbeat, but you can. So heartbeat is decided by the nodes inside the heart, but it can be controlled, but fasten up or can be slowed down or sped up. Sorry, by the autonomic system. And the sweat glands, all that stuff is controlled. So everything that is under control of the cardiac muscle or smooth muscle, such as, for example, your blood vessels. So if you have vasodilation, it's controlled by an autonomic system, or vasoconstriction, the same thing. All right. Now, the autonomic system works slightly different than the somatic system. So when it comes to the efferent nerves, they're actually made by two neurons. Okay, so you have two neurons that join at a ganglion. So the first neuron is referred to as the preganglionic neuron, and like in the somatic system, it has its body and its dendrites in the spine, okay, within the spinal cord, and then the axon comes out and it reaches the ganglion, and there at the ganglion, that's where it synapses with the second neuron, which is referred to as the postganglionic neuron in the pathway. This is the neuron that then comes out from the ganglion and then connects to the final effector, whether it is a smooth muscle in your arterioles, or it could be some your heart, and so on. That's where it comes from, the signal. Now, in some circumstances, there is no ganglion and no postganglionic neuron, and instead you have the first neuron, so the preganglionic neuron, connects directly to a gland. And instead of having a postganglionic neuron there, instead you have the gland, which now is acting basically instead of the ganglion, would act through the production of a hormone. So here is a comparison between how the somatic and the autonomic peripheral nervous system, or efferent systems, are organized. So this is how the somatic system is organized. You have a single neuron at this point carrying the information all the way from the spine, that's where the body and the dendrites of this neuron are, through a myelinated axon here all the way to the effector. When it comes instead to the autonomic efferent pathways, you have a two neuron system. So you have now the first neuron, similar to the somatic motor neuron, comes out from the spine. There it's myelinated as well, exactly like this somatic motor neuron. And then it reaches a ganglion, an autonomic ganglion here, where it synapses with a second neuron. So the first neuron is referred to as the preganglionic neuron, the second one as the postganglionic neuron, because it comes in the direction of the signal after the ganglion. And this is the neuron that ultimately connects with the effector, whether it's the heart, whatever it is, a gland, and so on. In some situation, you have that there is no ganglia here and no postganglionic neuron, but you have that the preganglionic neuron, still myelinated here, connects directly to a gland, such as in this example would be the adrenal medullum glands here, right above your kidney. We'll talk about that when we talk about the hormones and so on. So the endocrine system. So now, finally, when it comes to the somatic efferent pathways, there is only one type. When it comes instead to the autonomic pathways here, you can distinguish actually two different divisions there. You have what we call a sympathetic autonomic system and a parasympathetic autonomic system. They are organized in a similar way. However, they act in different situations. So the sympathetic autonomic system is the one that gets activated under stress or danger or anger. For example, during one of my tests, your sympathetic autonomic system is the one that gets your glands to sweat, your heart rate to go up, and so on, and you to burn more, probably glycogen to produce more energy. Whereas once the test is finished and finally you feel relaxed, your blood pressure goes down, you stop sweating because of the activity of the parasympathetic autonomic system, which again acts when you're quiet in a low stress situation. So it's the one that ultimately it takes care of all the regular systems that are not necessarily connected with stress and so on, such as, for example, digestions. This picture just summarizes what I just mentioned, the division between the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, and basically how they work and what they work on, but you don't need to remember these details. So summarizing, how does the human nervous system looks like? So we have a central nervous system with the brain and a connected spine. Both of these components are protected by the skull, and here the vertebrae here. And then from the central nervous system through nerves, two nerves coming out from each segment here of the spinal cord, you have the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system that can be divided first of all into an afferent peripheral nervous system. This is unique, is the same so for all the nervous system here, and is the one that's in charge of basically bringing all the information, whatever it is. It could be blood pressure, it could be your oxygenation level in your blood, the presence of light or heat. It brings it from the periphery, whether it's an organ, your skin, whatever it is, into the central nervous system. And here we get integrated by the brain. Sometimes, if it's a reflex, it simply goes into an interneuron. Do you remember at the beginning of the lecture when we're talking about the spinal reflexes? That's what happens. Gets integrated briefly and then generates a signal coming out. And when the signal is coming out, we're talking about the efferent peripheral nervous system. Okay. Peripheral nervous system that can be divided now into two major components. You have the somatic and the autonomic system. The somatic system is that system consisting of a single neuron in this case. So each somatic pathway will consist of a single neuron, a single neuron, then a group of nerves made by single neurons carrying information from the spine or the central nervous system to anything that is controlled by skeletal muscle, and generating mostly voluntary movements, but also some involuntary movements that are still under control of skeletal muscles. And then the second component of the efferent peripheral nervous system is the automatic system that basically can be of two types. Sympathetic autonomic system is activated when you're angry. So it's in charge of activating all of basically those structures that are needed when you are under stress or scared and so on. Whereas the parasympathetic autonomic system is the one that takes care of all the basic function that you need to get going once you're nicely relaxed. And so they control either cardiac muscle or any structure that's under control of smooth muscles or glands directly. So summarizing what we talked about in these two parts, all part of the same lecture on the nervous system. First, we review the structure of the nervous tissue. We talked about the type of neurons and other cells like glial cells and so on. Then we differentiate between the afferent and efferent neurons, particularly putting them in the context of nervous circuits, which are those circuits where information is detected by an afferent component, could be a receptor or directly a neurons, brought to the central nervous system, integrated there, and brought out, generating a response through the efferent component of the nervous system. With the smallest system basically consisting on three simple neurons: an afferent neuron, an interneuron, and an efferent neuron. Then we talked about how is the signal generated and carried through neurons. So we talked first about the membrane potential. That millivolt 70 minus 70 millivolt potential is present at rest in neurons. And then we saw how it can be changed through graded potential, which are basically small transient changes of the membrane potential, or action potential, which are those potential generated once the membrane potential reaches a certain threshold, and these are the ones that then are carried by the carried information ultimately through the axon. Then we focus on the different types of receptor or sensory receptor or afferent receptors there. Then we talked about how the signal that is generated by an actual potential is actually transferred through the axon. It can transfer continuously in short and larger in diameter axons, or in a saltatory way in myelinated, so long and narrow and covered by myelin sheath type of axons. Then we talked about the different types of communication between one neuron and the effector or two neurons, which was what we refer to as synapses. So we talk about electric synapses, how they basically carry through gap junction directly the electric signal to the other cell, or the chemical synapses, which instead rely on neurotransmitter to transfer the signal from one to another one. And then we talked about how this information that's carried from synapses ultimately is integrated at the axon hillock, so that part between the body of the neuron and the axon, how all of these graded potentials generated by the synapses are integrated there to the process of summation. Summation that can be either temporal, takes place from a single synapses, depends on the frequency in which this synapse is activated, or spatial, which is the consequence of the activity of two or more synapses at the same time or very close in time together, increasing, basically adding together different graded potential. Then we talked about briefly the evolution of the nervous system from a very simple system consisting of just a nerve nets and cnidarians all the way to the complex system, such as the one we have here, which is the one we finished up with, our human nervous system, which consists of a central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and a peripheral nervous system, which could be somatic, autonomic, sympathetic, or parasympathetic.